It's actually quite dramatic. I mean, this long black tube is feeding the city. You know what Mulholland said when it was completed, don't you? There it is, take it. And we did. Just this simple pipe has so much history associated with it. I mean, it's not too much to say it created the city of Los Angeles.
Yes, this morning we're standing next to the Los Angeles Aqueduct cascade in the San Fernando Valley. This is how the water gets delivered from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. We're about 233 miles from the point where the water is taken into the aqueduct and out of the river. Yes, right here we have two cascades. The one next to us is the original Mulholland Cascade from 1913. To my left is the second cascade, which we built in the 1960s. It was finished in 1970. The percentage of water we get from the Owens Valley has varied over the years. Some years it would be as much as 90%. More recently, it's been closer to 50%.
The Panama Canal and the Owens River Aqueduct are considered the two great engineering feats of that time. And the thing about the aqueduct from Owens Valley is that it's completely gravity flow. There's not a, they're not power pumps pumping water up at any hills. It's all that. So the planning of it was fabulous. And of course, here credit has to be given to an early engineer and mayor of LA, Fred Eaton, who is part of an old Pasadena family. Fred Eaton and my granddad had an interesting relationship and stimulated each other, and eventually fell out because Fred Eaton was of a more capitalistic bent, whereas my granddad, who wasn't really a socialist, but he wasn't as driven for material gain.
Eaton was the man. He was the one who had this vision of bringing water from the Eastern Sierra to Los Angeles for the sake of development. He'd been a mayor, and after his mayoralty term, he began to speculate to buy land in the Owens Valley. Later, the figure of Joseph Lippincott was involved in doing the same thing. So between the two of them, they bought land, and Lippincott bought a lot of it for the city of Los Angeles.
When all the accusations began to fly about exploiting and depriving Owens Valley people of their water, Fred Eaton, in a way, did have designs for land development and profit, whereas my granddad never owned a clod of dirt in Owens Valley.
He wasn't the real culprit in all of this, the one guilty of a lot of skullduggery. He was an engineer, a very accomplished guy, a kind of builder. It was Eaton and Lippincott and people like that who were involved in the kind of water grab and property duplicity that set up the building of the aqueduct.
My dad used to tell the story of a group of real estate men who approached him and wanted to just buy a bunch of land in this, that was going to be impacted or helped by the arrival of Owens Valley water, and my granddad would have nothing to do with it. No, count him out. He was not doing this. He was working for the city.
Although the city has gotten a lot of bad press over the whole thing, Mulholland wasn't responsible for that.
I think when you get into these these big epic history things, or you get in these adversarial battles and whatnot, it's really important to try to understand all of the people that are around you. And William Mulholland is amazing. I mean, he is totally amazing.
It truly is a remarkable story of not just the vision of the Irish immigrant from Belfast, but also the fact that many people of diverse backgrounds helped him build it. I truly believe Mulholland was a saint. I believe a few of the others probably weren't as sainthood as all, and let history call those people out. But Mulholland was here for the water and was here for the people. He really had a vision, and a very special person.
My first knowledge of my grandfather was as a grandfather, a rather gruff old man who always smoked a cigar, or always had a cigar in his mouth. I don't know, the men in those days didn't seem to smoke them as much as just sort of chew them. And patted us on the head and wanted to know how we were doing in school. Did you get a good grade on your report card? And if you did, then he'd reach in his pocket and he'd give us $1, which in the 1930s was a pure fortune. Then, of course, in grammar school, we began to learn about California history. And so the story of water, how the Spanish had dealt with water, with canals, and especially around the old plaza of LA, the zanjas that were built, feeders from the LA River to provide water for people and their stock there in this little pueblo that was Los Angeles at that time.
The earliest LA water system was the LA River. The city got its water by gravity. They went upstream on the LA River near Griffith Park. They built channels and conduits, and they took the water out of the riverbed and ran it down to the city in ditches. So it was a gravity system. The LA Aqueduct we're standing next to, 233 miles. The water comes to LA solely by gravity. There's no pumping at all. So the systems are very similar, it's just the difference in scale.
Then I realized that that's where we learned about water, and that it was brought from the high mountains through an aqueduct. And we were introduced to that whole idea of transporting water from great distances, and that the Romans had done it. And that's where the word came from.
Well, Los Angeles is heavily dependent on imported water. About 85% of our water comes from outside of the city, from 3 places right now. The Owens Valley, through the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which brings water directly and exclusively to LA, but also the Colorado River and the Sacramento Delta.
So in public school, I learned about it. But then as I got older, in high school, I began to read the negative stories, the bad stories about water thieves, the corrupt men who had gone up and stolen the water. And so because the way my mind works, I was unresolved about what to think about this. Was my grandfather a hero or a villain? In a sense, that went right through my life, always that question of this very difficult achievement that he had created, and that people interpreted in different ways, some seeing it as a blessing and some as a curse.
We're at a very historic spot in Los Angeles history. This is the William Mulholland Memorial Fountain at the corner of Los Feliz Boulevard and Riverside Drive. At this particular site, William Mulholland did, in his early days, working in water, long before the Department of Water and Power and his involvement with the city, controlled the irrigation ditch for water out of Griffith Park along the Los Angeles River as it fed the little pueblo, Los Angeles.
It was a private water company, and he went to work for them.
And became the, kind of the water master, and stories of him coming home from the library with all those books and teaching himself all of the math, all of the engineer, people whining about, opportunity and whining about education and whining about all of this stuff. And here's this guy that educated himself and probably never whined a day in his life, and developed this incredible aqueduct.
There is no doubt that the opponents of my granddad and the water group some of them were old timers who just didn't want to see change, period. They liked things the way they were in the Pueblo. They didn't want it to turn into a big metropolis. So they simply didn't, they were the anti-progressive folk, you might say. But there were other entrepreneurial ones, the new ones coming up, who had great designs on land and property and development for the area. And they saw that water would be, absolutely the major requirement for any success. And it was those groups who had organized and formed in the major one, the LA Farming and Milling Company, which owned most of the San Fernando Valley.
The speculation on land in the San Fernando Valley, which is what these guys were, why they kept it a secret for as long as they did. When I was doing research on Chinatown, I was introduced to Noah Dietrich, who had been the CPA for this group of guys when they were buying up the land in the valley. And
Harrison Otis and Sherman and all those guys, yeah.
Yeah, and and he told me, he said, because they were buying the land at 25, 50, up to a couple hundred an acre.
No water.
It was the whole valley.
The cabal, or the dirty story that came to be told, was that somehow Mulholland and the water guys were in league with the syndicate. And so there was always this reference when I was growing up about the San Fernando Valley land grab, that the aqueduct was simply being built to benefit these capitalists who had acquired all this land in the San Fernando Valley. And this was not true, but it seemed true.
At the first few years, when the aqueduct was finished, there was agriculture in the San Fernando Valley, and some of the surplus water was used for that agriculture. But within 2 years, the entire San Fernando Valley was annexed into the city of LA. And they decided at that point that only the city of LA would get to use the water, nobody else. So they didn't use after that, they didn't use any surplus water except within the city itself. And of course, within a few years after that, there was essentially no more agriculture in the valley. It was purely residential.
It's a complicated story. It's not a simple movie where the good and the evil are well defined, but you've got all these shades of gray coming in, and you realize that the complexities of this story make it difficult for the average person to want to bother figuring out, so you take a side.
The old Owens River comes around the corner, so from here north the water's in the original Owens River channel, and Mulholland and his crew built this diversion structure. So this diverts the water away from the river and puts it around the corner and into the aqueducts. So this structure, this is the intake, this is where the aqueduct started. This was built in 1911. The actual aqueduct opened in 1913, but this structure was built 2 years earlier, 2 years before that. They started construction at a bunch of different locations up and down the valley. So this is where the aqueduct starts, and the water is in the original Owens River channel until this point, and this is where it's diverted into the aqueduct. And I'll give you a little quiz. Why did Mulholland, and it was actually Fred Eaton who thought of the idea of bringing the Owens River down to Los Angeles, but why did Mulholland, when he started doing the engineering, decide on this specific spot in the Owens Valley? Why didn't he take the water out of the Owens River some other location? Gravity. So the way I like to tell people is this is the point where they determined they needed to take the water out of the original Owens River channel and put it into an artificial conveyance system, the aqueduct that they built, so they could gravity feed it all the way to Los Angeles. I'd like to show you where the diversion structure is, where the water is actually diverted out of the river. We can kind of talk a little bit about that and then come back here.
Early progressive and even radical writers, not communists, but socialist historians, like to group the water group as the water thieves. They stole from the Owens Valley to bring water down, and this cabal again had legs. And of course I started living with it big time in the 1970s when the movie Chinatown appeared, because that has been taken up as if it were a documentary film instead of a piece of fiction. And the fact that they used water as a symbol made it a very interesting, and it's a wonderful movie. I mean, I'm sorry it is, because if it had been a bad movie, we wouldn't be talking about it today.
Well, the movie was a great sensation, and a lot of people never did make the equation of the real historical events and the film, which they saw as a detective story about Los Angeles. But those who were involved in the burgeoning environmental movement in Eastern California, in Mono Lake, and then in the Owens Valley proper, would often turn to the Chinatown film, as it became better known, as an example or as a demonstration of the exploitation, the water grab, the incestuous politics, all that fostered the development of the aqueduct. So they were using it more rhetorically, more as a persuasion technique. You want to know all the bad things that happened here, watch this movie. Well, the irony was, of course, that the movie wasn't accurate about the actual events that took place, but it was quite stimulating.
A lot of us loved your film. I tell you. I mean, it's just tremendous.
The DWP was very cranky when it came out.
They have very thin skin.
Yeah, I was amazed.
Yeah, very thin skin.
You know.
For having all this power.
Yeah.
But it was a good and gripping film, and a lot of people have accepted it as a historic document about the history of LA. And because of this error and confusion, we all need some re-education in our Southern California history.
Well, here, look. This took place at the turn of the century, didn't it? From about around 1903, 1905. And I moved it, for obvious reasons, to 1936, 37. Actually, the war over the water was still going on in the 30s. It was a 20, 30-year battle. But in order to dramatize it, you had to telescope it into a matter of months. It's impressive, actually. If you came in close, it would almost look like a painting. A lot of the events that occurred in the Owens Valley, we shifted to a sort of amorphous valley. You know, we had the orange groves. So we never really had any reason to come up here, because it was simpler to explain the land speculation in terms of the San Fernando Valley, really. In fact, it was the Owens Valley that was destroyed. But part of that destruction was dramatized with the farmers in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley.
Well, after the first aqueduct was finished, there was a time. It was in 1913. There was a time of quiet during the teens, and because people accepted that this large, powerful city far away had come in and owned land and owned water, all legitimately, all legally, and nothing was going to reverse that. But when the city came back in the 20s for more water and began to buy up the rest of the valley, the whole entire north end around Big Pine and Bishop, that's when people really became upset.
Well, Los Angeles pretty much owns everything. They own all the land, they own our history, the local people's history here. They own all the water that comes off the mountains, they're guaranteed by Act of 1937 that they own that. And water's power, and that's what they own. They control the land. They're very politically involved in everything up here. All their employees, they have like 900 employees in this area. Or Inyo County only has 18,000 people or so. That's a pretty big percentage.
My father ended up with 90 acres here that we're still on, and has the mobile home park on. And through the years, after my father and mother passed away, I inherited it. And in fact, my wife and I, we farmed 90 acres for the first 12 years of our marriage. Of the 320 acres my grandfather homesteaded, there's not 1 square inch of it has ever gone to the Department of Water and Power. So I'm very proud of that. Some of the very few private acres still owned by a family, I mean privately owned. 90% of this valley floor is owned by the Department of Water and Power. So this is a very unique situation that this much private land is still in private hands and not in the department hand.
I think the entire city of Los Angeles comprises 460 odd square miles of property. We own in excess of that in the Owens Valley area. But the result of this massive land purchase, this massive land aggregation for the water rights has been that property remains pristine. It remains immensely well cared for.
What we have in the Owens Valley is kind of like a historic or a fossil landscape, a landscape that used to exist widely in California, even in the San Fernando Valley. I know people that grew up there when there were individual towns. But what we have is we have these small towns with open space in between, and of course these beautiful mountains. But a lot of those places have all filled in, and just with rampant development all throughout California. I'm from the Bay Area. I've seen the same thing happen. You can't drive the freeways of San Francisco. They're probably worse than the ones in LA as far as I'm concerned.
If you're purchasing land for the water rights, it's a consequence, and I think a foreseeable consequence, that land cannot be developed because you're trying to take the water that underlies the land to somewhere else. But the result gives all of us a wonderful view of just what these pristine areas looked like once upon a time, and really is a unique place, and people visit it and marvel at its beauty and are thankful that it hasn't been invaded by development, and that too is a legacy of the LADWP acquisition.
What occurred here is that in 1924, people that wanted to sell out their ranches and their businesses and wanted to get what they felt was a fairer price. They were having no luck with the city of Los Angeles. The people were resigned that they had lost the land and water battle, because this was the second time that Los Angeles came back. 1913, they finished the first aqueduct, and that was supposed to be all the water the city would ever need for all time. And 10 years later, 1923, they were back, and they were going to buy the whole upper part of the valley. So people came down realizing that LA was going to take it all. They wanted to get a price. They went up and encouraged the ditch master to step away from the mechanisms and cut the lock, open the gates, and they dumped the entire aqueduct right down through here for about 3 or 4 days.
My dad and grandfather had all gone through all this when the water wars, you might call it, and when they were buying out all this stuff. And I'm not sure if my dad, he never did admit it, but I think he was probably down there on the aqueduct when they had the...
You think your dad was down on the LA?
I'm not sure. I don't know. He never did admit to it, but he knew all about it.
But they eventually negotiated with Los Angeles, who said they would, go away and make a deal in good faith. And so the anarchists here, they were pretty tame folk. They were just Owens Valley folk, and they went on home. They attempted to continue to negotiate a fair price for the final buyout. It broke down, and And so some people, we really don't know who, they began to blow the aqueduct. They blew the big pipe siphons to the south. They sometimes blew out the side of the aqueduct here, blew up wells. Los Angeles hired 500 Pinkertons, brought them up here on a train, and they set up towers with lights, set up roadblocks or stopping points on the public highway in Inyo County. And eventually about 1935, there was a reparations bill in the Assembly, and Los Angeles bought out the final ranches and farms, and they bought out the towns even.
You know, these leases that we have, the department land that we've been on here, my dad, in the 60s, my grandfather had pieces of property here and there around Independence and other parts in the valley, because when his dad sold his land down there closer to Alabama Gates, when he sold that to the department, the amount of money that they offered him was 3 times what it was worth or more, and there was, most of them were small homesteads. So on one of those drainages down there, there was like 9 families trying to all live off of one stream down there, and in the dry years it was virtually a wipeout.
Well, I have here a history of the Matlick family. Al's granddaughter, Al was my grandfather, and this is another granddaughter. Al's granddaughter, Grace Matlick Wofford, recalled when Los Angeles representatives were buying property, hiding in the bushes outside the Matlick house. She saw a group of men approach Al again about selling his ranch. He met them on the porch, shotgun in hand, and said, "If you don't get off my land, I'm gonna kill you." Grace was so frightened, she ran home to her mother and cried, "Grandpa has a gun and he's going to kill a bunch of men." She doesn't recall what happened after that, but Al was successful in dissuading them. So that was one way of getting rid of them.
They bought the valley.
I know.
Yeah, and so they own in this valley 240,000 acres.
And so that land is now
leased back for grazing, but not developed.
While the city sought to prevent settlement and population and thereby preserved a open environment, they did things that harmed the environment too. But that was small consolation to the people who lived there at the time. And they had a store or a bank in the town and a ranch outside of town, and they wanted to preserve their community, to continue living there and to enjoy the fruits of a kind of cohesive small town community.
We've been on these lands that I have here in Independence, we've been on these for 50 years.
wow.
You know, pretty much treat them like they're our own. I mean, it's 100% public access for the most part. We're allowed to take public access off no more than 25% of the lands that we lease, and we don't virtually lock up any of it because the public's been using them. You know, that was part of the way they kept the public from completely turning against them, is they allowed everybody, you know, in the valley and everybody else, and they promoted the people from Los Angeles that these were their lands and they should use them. So they were always left open to the public, and it's been that way so long. If you tried to lock them up, you'd have a problem.
We're part of the Great Basin Geological Province, meaning that the valley here drains to Owens Lake. There's no outlet to the sea. And so the water here is coming from the Sierra Nevada, which provides a tremendous amount of runoff because that captures the Pacific storms. It's a very high mountain range. We can see peaks here that are in the clouds right now today at nearly 14,000 feet. And so there's a tremendous snowpack, which melts over the spring and summer and feeds the Owens River.
What makes it unique is the fact that we really are in a desert. Our rainfall here is only about 6 inches a year. That's all that comes down from the sky. But you can see the snow in the Sierra Nevada, and that flows down out of many, many creeks and fills up what is actually a very deep basin that's full of alluvium, and it fills that up with water. And we have had for quite some time a very high water table all throughout the Owens Valley.
The word Inyo, which is this county's called it, one description of the name was the Chief George of the Paiutes of way back. It was called the land of the great spirits, and that's how I look at it. If you can look at our mountain up here, it's got a face on it. We have a lot of really ancient areas and beautiful areas up here. And what other cathedral could ever surpass these mountains? Man could never build something as this pretty.
So what the city did with Mulholland's aqueduct was to capture this runoff and send it down the aqueduct to the city.
Our biggest problem is trying to keep some of the water here. We know that we can never take it all back, but we need some to keep the place green.
Although we live in a desert, when it's measured by rainfall, we actually live in a fairly well-watered environment. You know, these are not grasslands, these are meadows. The difference being that a grassland is sustained by precipitation, a meadow is sustained by groundwater. And so these meadows, many of them were natural. They were here when the first settlers came. They were here when the Paiute lived here. They are being sustained now largely with irrigation because the groundwater pumping has dropped that water table below the level of the roots.
Oh, this is a groundwater well that pumps groundwater from this area. This pipe leads over to an underground pipe which feeds into the McNally Canal, which is off this direction. You can see the trees and the reddish willows over there are at the edge of the canal. So this would be taking groundwater, putting it in the canal. This canal eventually makes its way down to the Owens River, which in this part of the valley is the conveyance of water that goes down eventually to the aqueduct. This canal was originally here as an irrigation project, supplying water for agriculture. With the second aqueduct that came in 1970, the city had the capacity to take more than the usual amount of runoff, and so they supplemented that runoff by pumping groundwater. And these wells, I think, were generally put in the 1920s during a drought period when the runoff was very low. They used them a couple of times up until the 1970 when the second aqueduct came in, and so they're just able to export more water by having groundwater wells.
So one of the main features of the valley was this, what's left over from the 1872 earthquake. And this, you can see where the valley, where it dropped off right here. Yeah. And that big fault, this is the main fault line right over where this bench is. And it runs all the way up to Tinnamaha and then runs clear right there where Alabama Gates is sitting and above the aqueduct there. That's the fault, the main fault. But it's what creates this anomaly here where water tables, it's an impervious barrier, so that water isn't released, a lot of it on that side of the fault. It's holding it all, most of it's filled here, and the big aquifer is above the, or west of the fault. And that's why DEP has pumps all through this Independence area and all that, and all the pumps are up here. There's no pumps east of the fault. All those canyons where the creeks come out, all that water either comes down and runs directly into the aqueduct, or when during the summer, say May and June, when we get the snow melt, if it's more than they can handle in the aqueduct, they have structures all up there at the base of the foothills, and they turn that water out on the alluvial fan, and they percolate that water in the fan, and it shows up down here in the aquifer. And so all they enhance their well production by turning that water out up there. And you could see the variation. We drove down the road on the south side where it was pretty much all grassland, and on the north side where the taller brush was, that's just a foot of change in the depth of groundwater changes the type of plant life we have.
The amount of water that's taken by runoff, we've never really dealt with, because that was even though you would love it to be Christmas, and some of those streams would make it to the floor of the valley like they used to and build these incredible wetlands, that was over a long time ago. But the second aqueduct that was dealing with groundwater pumping and new impacts, that's the world, that's the modern water world, their war that we work with.
If you look from right here, this is an old ancient irrigation ditch, and from pretty much here on down it was greener. And right now only the bottom lands right down there, they're the only green parts now to this area. So we got to fight for that all the time, because LA always wants to pump or not pump, or any water that is in the creeks, they want it to flow straight through as fast as possible.
All those meadows that I still have a little piece of on my property are gone, and so are the beautiful flowers that used to be everywhere. There aren't as many, and of course it's progress, and we don't have too many more people because there isn't that much private land up here. But we do see the difference in the trees going. Unfortunately, they don't plant more, so it's very devastating to see that happen.
No, this is a beautiful place. And I think a lot of the passion and a lot of the energy that she sensed coming out of environmental activists comes from knowing that this is fragile. And if you've been taken to see some of the impacts on the well fields, some of the places that used to look like this and now are just dead ground with a few Russian thistles and stuff blowing around in the breezes, you'll realize why it is that we're scared. And it doesn't come back easily. The area behind my house, which is now just filled with weeds, I mean, it's pretty, but it hasn't got any water on it like this stuff has. That used to be the Hillside Dairy back in the 60s. When the water was taken off of that, that's one of the things they did with the second barrel of the aqueduct in 1970. They shut down a lot of irrigated agriculture. It saved water. They dug up, they physically destroyed a lot of willows and cottonwood trees. They suck water, they take it out of the ground, they put it in the air. They deliberately got rid of riparian vegetation. That area behind my house, this is now 2009, it has not come back. It doesn't revegetate itself with grass. There's no water underneath it. If it's not irrigated, it doesn't come back. There's a fear that this valley could come to look like that if the vigilance is taken away, because the city's mission is to deliver water to its people. There's less water in the West to deliver. They want every drop they can. We have a real basic conflict here.
I've been to the Owens Valley a number of times. I plan to continue to visit very frequently. Our destiny is linked inextricably to that of the Owens Valley. We are bound together by history. This city flourished because of the water that came to us from the Owens Valley. It's essential that we have a relationship of trust and credibility. I think that has not been the way one would characterize this relationship in the past. But I think we've made strides with this Mayor Villaraigosa coming into office. He said that we were going to meet our environmental obligations honorably. That is a charge that we've taken very seriously. And I've been up to the Owens Valley a number of times, and I'll continue to go.
That language, that green, integrate the environment with human use, that language originates in Los Angeles. It has not yet filtered up here to the people on the ground that run the Northern Aqueduct Division for the city of Los Angeles. They are still very much old guard. It's our land, it's our water, we'll do things our way. And that's pretty much word for word what they have said to us in public meetings. So I think that what has to happen is the consciousness that the voters of the city of Los Angeles have put in to their administration. That consciousness needs to make its way onto the ground up here into actual management and implementation.
This is a relationship which by its very nature is delicate and requires a deft handling in many ways, and so we're going to continue into the future. But I believe we've now put in place the building blocks for an open and trusting dialogue, as I say, as we look to the future.
We fought the second water war because the city was back in '69 and they finished a second aqueduct, which was a pipe just down south that allowed them to take 50% more water.
Yeah, we looked at it.
Yeah, and that was going to be filled with groundwater. So when those pumps came on in 1970, places up here where there's fish hatcheries, fish springs, south of Big Pine, that had a river of water coming out of the ground, 20,000 acre-feet of water a year. It's extinct. And Black Rock, another fish hatchery up the road, you'll pass tomorrow. It also went extinct.
They dried up every major spring in the valley but one. Rheinheckel Spring is still flowing. All the rest of them basically were dried up due to groundwater pumping. So the groundwater tables have been lowered, vegetation has died.
And this is not ugly, this is okay, but it's not what you saw down there by the river. And it's not what you're going to see in the irrigated pastures as you drive by where the cattle are grazing and you can't do anything with this land. They'll turn cattle out here, 2-3 head. They'll turn a few burros out in here, but this land doesn't support anything. It barely supports jackrabbits.
There were issues in the 70s and 80s with dust problems being created. Down near Highway 395, south of Independence, there's some alfalfa fields that are put in as dust mitigation because the native vegetation was killed by the groundwater table being lowered, and you don't have any vegetation holding the soil, and you had dust blowing across the highway. That was a major problem.
I didn't, a lot of us didn't. They kept it pretty quiet. We didn't really realize what was going on. They didn't have much of, I was busy making a living. We didn't really, so they put in another aqueduct, we didn't really get involved with it. And much to my, I've had other people say, what happened? Why didn't we? But they kept it quiet. They didn't ballyhoo it. It was a snow job, really. But that's when, and of course, that's when they started pumping heavy on down in the lower part of the valley and drying up a lot of that area.
So even our supervisors, who I trust barely more than the city of Los Angeles, they began to sue Los Angeles in 1972 using the new Environmental Quality Act that nobody understood. I think the district attorney pulled it out and said, we got this new law that says you have to look at impacts, if you're going to build something or drill something, and so they hauled LA in 72, and that kicked everything off.
The Owens Valley Committee was formed as an independent entity to look at the water issues, to look at the law, and to decide what really ought to be done here in the Owens Valley, especially relating to complying with the California Environmental Quality Act, called CEQA, and what was required under that act to mitigate for the impacts of the second barrel of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which was started in 1970. Huge impacts from that second barrel, which had never been addressed because the city didn't feel they had to do so.
Of course, by then the aqueduct was 65 years old, but because they were adding to it, in effect expanding the same aqueduct, they were made to required to file an environmental impact report by the courts, and of course the city dragged their feet on that for a long time, and that led to more and more involvement of the courts, and finally the courts taking over the control of the Los Angeles pumping into the aqueduct.
We finally got them in court and had a judge say, you will start that Lower Owens River project by January of 2007, or I am going to shut down your second aqueduct. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. It was a very dramatic statement for the judge to have said. Well, they had the river flowing by December of 2006.
In terms of unintended consequences, well, I'm absolutely certain that when the aqueduct was built, the drying of the Owens Lake over a period of just 13 years wasn't fully expected, that the drying up of the lower Owens River wasn't foreseen. But those were the consequences of the movement of great amount of water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. And there have been environmental problems that have been left in the wake of those activities. And we're moving forward to address them.
So starting in 1913, when they opened up the aqueduct, from here south there's about 60 miles of river channel between here and the old Owens Lake. It's about 30 miles as the crow flies, but it's about 62 miles of river channel because it's very sinuous. It winds a lot. And most of this was dry from 1913 on. Probably the biggest restoration project in the country that we've got going on right now, this is called the START. This is the Lower Owens River Project. This is the start of it. And we run a steady and continuous flow in the Owens River from here all the way to Owens Lake. 40 cubic feet per second, which is probably 10 to 20% of the aqueduct flow. We now run essentially parallel to the aqueduct. We just run it down the original Owens River channel. When it gets to lake, we have a pump station down there and we capture the water, and either the idea originally was to pump it into the aqueduct. You're still going to lose a lot to vegetation and groundwater and evaporation on the way. But the idea was to capture a significant portion and pump it into the aqueduct. Now, almost all the water is captured and pumped onto Owens Lake for dust mitigation, so it goes into that project down there.
The pumping station is the bottom end of the Lower Owens River project. And so they take about 3/4 of the water out of the river, and they can use it on the lake for dust, or they can actually pump it back up in the aqueduct. So it's artificial, like all water in California. I mean, geez, you know, you go in the Stanislaus River and Whitewater, you're looking at what time the dam's going to release the water. I mean, everything's, all the plumbing in California is artificial. So I don't look upon this as any more artificial than any other place in California. But there's 100 square miles here, and on this lake bed, 100 square miles. Underneath this is about 8,000 feet of sediments. There's no salt layers, so the lake never went dry, as far as we know. It's been around 1 million years or more, until the city of Los Angeles.
Well, the dry lake bed is certainly a very related problem hydrologically. The Owens Lake was full of water because the Owens River flowed into it. When the Owens River ceased to flow into it, it dried up. And when it dried up, it created the biggest particulate air pollution problems in the hemisphere.
It was the largest single dust site in the entire United States for particulate dust. That it was a regional problem all the way from Bishop all the way to San Bernardino.
Where the guy was working on the car?
They would announce it if the dust got to the point where it was affecting the people. And we were seeing a lot of it through the hospitals and schools and so on, so that they would send a warning to everyone, and that stay inside and to not be too active when the dust was blowing like that.
I was driving up from LA one day, or San Bernardino, and I was coming into Lone Pine, and there's this big brown cloud above Lone Pine, and I'm driving through it, and I started realizing, man, these people live like this? And then I started tasting some of the heavy metals that they have out on the lake in my mouth, and I started getting this metallic taste, and I said, man, how do these people handle it? Then I realized this wind is blowing north, and I just lived 60 miles. So I said, it's not just their problem, it's mine too.
It was an unstable surface because nature hadn't had a chance to balance all the issues out there, and that's why it blew. I mean, it was different than Great Salt Lake in Utah. It's different than other places because it was new. It was nature hadn't had a chance to fix it, and so Los Angeles is having a chance to fix it right now.
They call it Owens Dry Lake. I call it Owens Drained Lake. It was drained. It wasn't dry before DWP got there. Then they drained it. Now the politically correct term is Owens Dry Lake, but to me it's Owens Drained Lake. It'll always be Owens Drained Lake. They're trying to fill it up right now just to satisfy the EPA for dust control, but it's still drained, and they're still not done with their job. And that's still an argument. They don't like putting water on it to keep the dust down.
There's not really an off-the-shelf solution for this kind of dust control, short of you fill the lake back up again. You can't fill the lake back up again. That's the entire aqueduct.
You'd literally have to open up the Alabama gates again, and it might take 10 years to fill the lake And then it would take the entire aqueduct still, virtually, to continue going into the lake, and no water's going south, and that's just not going to happen. That's just not going to happen. Not even in fairy tales, politically, does that happen. So
the drying of the Owens Lake, it's becoming a dust bowl, and all of the damage that has come from that. Clearly, that could not have been an expected result. But the city has accepted its responsibility and has moved forward in order to remediate the dust conditions.
They certainly have done a lot in the, I'd say, 10 or 15 years they've been working on this and figuring out ways to keep the dust down, which one of them is putting shallow water flooding in, and from up here that looks like a lake full of water now. It's beautiful, and certainly has kept the dust down.
Oh yes, it's helped. Of course, they've spent millions of dollars on it too.
So there's about 35 square miles of this kind of situation out on this lake right now. Square miles, 35 square miles. It's just, it's huge.
There is an agreement to remediate an additional 13 square miles. A part of the issue that we face, especially now in a time of constrained water resources throughout the entire state, is whether that remediation should take place using really what will be potable water, or whether there are other means that are effective at controlling the dust, but which do not utilize what is pristine water, which would be utilized for human consumption. Those are some challenges that we have going forward. But in terms of the city's commitment to dealing with the dust problem in the Owens Lake, I think there is no doubt about that commitment, certainly not under the administration of this mayor, and certainly not under my administration.
It's been a gratifying situation that they have come in and got that problem fixed.
You know, I have a daughter that lives in LA. I go to Dodger games. I go to Felipe's before the game. I go to the Festival of Books, UCLA in April, Chris and I do. I mean, I like LA a lot, but we had this agreement up here in the early 80s to try to get some water to Los Angeles, but stop the damn bleeding up here. No more damage. And that's kind of been the struggle.
In the 80s, these wells weren't running. And it was finally settled and signed in '91, and all the guidelines were put into effect. It's made a difference. It's stabilized the water table. Now, after 3 or so dry years, when they're pumping, and they're still pumping, it's not that they're not pumping, it's just they have limitations on them. It's you'll see them decline, some of these wells, and some of them will still go dry. The ones up closer to the well fields, they'll still go dry.
Times change, the climate is changing. Literally, the climate is changing. The social climate's changing as well. But these are all things we're going to have to deal with. And I think that awareness of where your water comes from is getting higher. And that serves two purposes. One, it says, hey, our water use is hurting the Owens Valley. On the other hand, can say, all that beautiful water, they're slathering it on the Owens Dry Lake. You've got to be kidding me. It has a backlash that way, too.
I don't think that's ever the only solution that we're ever going to get to getting water out or the valley back to any shape is they find a way to desalinate that ocean down there to where they can cheaply enough. They can do it now, but it's way too expensive. This is much cheaper waters.
It's been better in a sense that there are people that, for whatever their motivations, want to solve some of these long-standing environmental problems that have been up here in the Eastern Sierra. Just the general discord between people.
We do have unfortunate environmental consequences which we have to move forward to remediate. And we must continue to build on this relationship. The last time I was in the Owens Valley, a rather elderly gentleman came up to me and he said, the worst thing that ever happened to this area was LADWP And the best thing that ever happened to this area was LADWP.
I don't know how much it had to do with a water problem, but in LA, when the Army took so much of the LA riverbed and made it concrete, that had a very deleterious effect on the water table in Los Angeles because of the fact that the LA riverbed is a trickle on top, but there's bedrock beneath, and there was in effect underground streams, which plants would draw on. Well, once you put concrete on the riverbed, that water couldn't percolate down to the bedrock and was lost out in the ocean.
So no recharge.
Yeah.
And I believe Los Angeles can, at this time, pump about 15% of their water needs locally.
We get about 15% of our water from our own indigenous resources, principally the San Fernando Valley Aquifer. But even that water supply right now is under some pressure because of contamination issues. But it is our own aquifer, and it provides, as I say, a small percentage overall of our water here.
And they're trying to clean up those aquifers. But if they would have possibly kept the river a little freer, recharge, bank the water. Right. A lot of people would like to try to go back and redo that or do it right, and everything's so much more expensive.
Well, ripping out the concrete would be a good thing.
Whew, boy.
The river has always had a really reliable underground water flow, throughout the 51 miles. What's been more scarce is the above ground water flows, and that's, most of the water from the river, or a lot of the water supply from the river was actually underground supplies. So it's perfect for LA, our invisible water supply.
Right now, we're almost midway on the Los Angeles River. This is one of the longest stretches of natural bottom, and it's known as Taylor Yard because of the proximity to the railroad area over here. And this area was purchased by California State Parks as one of 2 urban parks that we have along the river, and the river played a significant role in that acquisition to eventually one day have access where people can come down and enjoy this part. Most people just see the concrete and the Terminator 2, and so this is another section that we like to bring people
to. The city of Los Angeles was founded 228 years ago when 44 people walked 9 miles from the Mission San Gabriel to the banks of the Los Angeles River. If there was no river where it is now, it's kind of moved as we've channelized it over the years. I'd say we probably would have been the city of Santa Monica because they wouldn't walk all the way to the ocean. They came for the water.
Los Angeles is a river basin. The Los Angeles River drains major portions of LA's 3 mountain ranges, and that makes it one of the best sources for water in all of Southern California. And it was identified as one of the best sources of water by the first exploring party that came up through here from San Diego to Monterey. And they said we ran into this beautiful, well-watered valley. They were pretty much talking about this beautiful spot right here. And we think that it's the best settled spot for settlement that we've seen in our trip so far. And so that's why in 1781, the party of settlers came and actually founded the Pueblo quite close to this spot, because of the way that the geology works in the LA Basin, is actually the spot on the river itself that has the best above ground year-round supply of water. So this spot is really one of the most important spots historically in all of Los Angeles, and you can see that we've done wonderful things with it.
The river here in this area, from what would be geographical out in the northwest by where Glendale and Burbank is, all the way through Elysian Park where the Dodgers play, is an open bottom. It's a natural, because the water table is so high here because it all converges through this area, and if they did try to put concrete in there, it would pop it up.
Of the river's 52 miles, there are 13 of those miles that are actually still natural bottom. And so while the sides are in concrete, the bottom is not. And so you have natural vegetation, and a lot of it is invasive plants. However, it's green, there's life, there's a lot of bird life here. And so this is one of those places where people say, oh, this really is a river, and it really is. It was, it is a natural river. It's just been altered because of the flooding and the need to preserve life, commerce, and a way of life in Los Angeles, basically.
There's only two things you need in life: water and relationships. And once Los Angeles got water, it began to develop. And it would never last if we didn't have the great advantage and vision of William Mulholland, who founded the water system and figured out how to bring it down 200 plus miles away to feed the little pueblo, which now is one of the great metropolises of the world.
The Los Angeles River was the sole source of water for the city until 1913, when the Owens Valley Aqueduct came online.
There's this myth that the river was always dry seasonally. I mean, what happened was, even when they were still using the river as a water source, they were draining it and sort of turned it sandy. But I think historically the river was in places where it wasn't fully flowing, it might be mud or it might be swampy, but it wasn't usually completely dry.
The reason why downtown is where it is because of the confluence of the LA River and the Arroyo Seco. And so if you do go to downtown and you walk the proximity to the river, you can see, well, gosh, it is possible to dig ditches and divert water here, and that's exactly what happened.
Los Angeles is kind of an amazing river. It's the central natural fact of LA. It's a central historical fact of Los Angeles. It runs 51 miles through the heart of the Los Angeles area. Everyone's seen it, everyone's driven over it, everyone in the world has seen it because it's in all the movies. It's kind of an amazing river, but the most amazing thing about the Los Angeles River is that no one seems to know where it is, or even that it exists. So basically we've turned our back on the river for almost a century now.
Well, it's important to take care of a public space. We have great discussions on how to make more park space. Every space is important. The river is an important space where we've often had our back to the river. Now we could look to the river, especially in this part where it's quite natural. We have to keep our streets clean and get less pollutants, get pollutants out of the street. Our plastic bags or trash that people can't throw. We got to teach people to find a trash can, to recycle, reuse, so that the river stays cleaner.
Okay, we're not really, aiming for a wilderness here, but we're trying to restore it to be a healthy urban river, which is a very different thing. And I think a lot of cities, we just have a more extreme example of having destroyed our river and then trying to revitalize our river to really revive the city in some ways and address some of the problems we have. So it's something that you see all over the world, is people now trying to go back and green up and, treat their rivers sustainably.
It does serve us a great purpose when there's heavy storms, because our topography doesn't allow us to accept the water, and the Los Angeles River is mighty when it does rain.
Traditionally, this river was fed solely by rainwater. And as the population grew and as it continues to grow, and with the channelization of the river, we essentially have this water freeway. So when it rains, and the LA River watershed is over 800 square miles large, it's huge. So you have this huge funnel, and water is actually sweeping down into the streets, into storm drains, and then pushing out into this river that's been channelized into this huge, what people think of as a storm drain. And so you have a situation where, as the population grows and there's more pavement, you're not getting that recharge of the aquifers. You're getting this essentially fresh water that's hitting the streets and mingling with whatever trash and pollutants, and then it's flushed as quickly as possible down into the ocean.
So we are using our local water supplies to water the Pacific Ocean, and then we spend $1 billion a year to import 200 billion gallons of water, and it's 20% of LA's energy output, so ding, 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 global warming, to import 200 billion gallons from watersheds all across the West, at significant social and ecological damage to those watersheds. So that's how we manage our water now, which doesn't make a whole lot sense.
It's developed into the situation where, if you think about it, we have all this fresh water. If we could just retain it, and that's one of the thoughts in terms of revitalizing the river and being able to take concrete out at places like where we're standing right here, because there is land available. So the thing would be that you would retain water off-site, slow the river down so that you can control it, and any kind of planting or terracing would not be washed out. And there's also an opportunity to really look at this water that we're flushing. Now, the reason why there's so much water in the river year-round now is that there are 3 water reclamation plants, one in the Sepulveda Basin in the San Fernando Valley that discharges about 75 million gallons of water a day, and that's treated water, tertiary treated, and it's much cleaner than what's washing off the streets. So now we do have this year-round water supply, and you can see that reflected in the way that the birds are coming and using it. It's a really significant habitat on the flyway.
So it's really a question of not, is it bad idea to put treated sewage in the river? Because the fact is that treated sewage is incredibly clean. You know, when I tell people, it's like, don't lick your toes, but maybe you could, you know, if you're walking around here barefoot. The question is, can we recycle our water out of our sanitation systems and make it really, really clean, and then inject it back into wetlands? And it will go through the ground, and it will get even cleaner, and then we'll pump it back up and we'll recycle it back through, and maybe we'll even put some of that in the river so that the river actually has some water in it, so it can be like nice recreational resource. So it's really, I think, we have to manage the river incredibly intensively, but that's not a bad thing. It's a question of how, not how much.
I think we've lagged behind in terms of water reclamation, for instance. We see around the world water reclamation being deployed highly successfully, both for irrigation and for drinking purposes. And yet Los Angeles, I think, had a unfortunate experience with exactly this technology. It was politically found unacceptable.
You know, over the years I worked with Water and Power. 35 years, about 2 years I worked at Water and Power. It was right when the East Valley Water Reclamation Plant came online. When they broke ground, the then governor and then mayor stood shoulder to shoulder praising, this is the wave of the future. By the time it was built, one headline from a local paper, toilet to tap, flushed the whole project away. And then we had to re-educate people about water. You don't make water. Water is a natural thing. When water goes through the soil and goes through earth, it gets nursed back to life.
So now we find that other communities, other societies have moved ahead of us, including Orange County, just a few miles to the south of us here. But it's okay. We can learn from others as well, and if we're seeing good examples to follow, it's fine for us to do that as well, and hopefully this will lead to greater acceptance on the part of Angelinos, because they'll see examples around the world which will show them that water recycling is really nothing to be fearful of today, and that this is a ready way for us to augment our water supply without having to be continually dependent on external resources.
But with that being said, you're going to see more of interest in the river as the bikeway gets expanded further south with my colleagues, Mr. Garcetti and Mr. Reyes. Mr. Reyes, the chair of the committee, very pro river, which helps everyone. I'm pro river, but when people start riding bikes on the river, they'll have stories about the river. And when people have a relationship, like I said, water and relationship, when you have a relationship with something, then it boosts morale, interest, and one day we'll ride a bike all the way down to Long Beach.
The river has continued to be an important factor in people's lives. It has everything to do with the way we manage our water. And as we know from Chinatown, the way we manage our water has everything to do with lots of things in the city. And we've lost our understanding of how our everyday lives are connected to what happens on our major river, including where our water comes from. So I think that, to me, one of the biggest challenges in revitalizing the river is not just to do something with the concrete walls and to make it a greenway and a bikeway, but we have to kind of reinstall the the river into the city's collective imagination, and not just as a joke, and not just as the place where you have the motorcycle chase scenes where the alien, chases you from the tractor trailer, but really the place of the river in Los Angeles' history, and also in the Los Angeles environment that we inhabit.
The fact that again, this was the sole source of water, and we think of it as, at one time there was a proposal to turn it into a freeway. So that our sense of history does change and shift so much, and we get our water from bottles, don't drink the tap water, that's not good enough. Again, you fly into Los Angeles, you see swimming pools. So let's fly into Los Angeles and see this greenway.
One of the problems with the LA River that's going to make this process much slower than we would like is that we have to actually reclaim some floodplain and do that without eminent domain. And, because the river is so built up in most places, right up to the edges. So I think some of the tributaries, it's going to be easier to do projects where you can actually take out concrete. On the LA River itself, I think you will eventually see that. There are people who disagree, but I think most of us feel like you will eventually see that. But in the meantime, what we're looking at is places that do other things to the channel to maximize water supplies and make it user-friendly. So you could, for example, the bottom could be soft, the walls could be soft so that you would have greenery. You could pull back the walls. You could cant them differently to make it, and terrace them to make them. So there's all kinds of things that you can do without compromising the integrity of the flood control that right now we actually really do need.
I would like to see some check dams along the river so that in the low flow seasons, which sometimes is much longer than we like, you could have a little water, because when people do see water, they feel stronger. When people walk around the reservoirs, they feel better, and they see water. So I'd like to see some check dams that could go up and down to catch the low flow, because when it's the off season, it's over many millions of gallons a day go down there from our water plants, which again, we'll try to direct that water eventually to a recycled use, but there's still going to be water in the river.
We really have to reimagine things. There is a transformation that is going on right now in the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. You mentioned a drought a few minutes ago, and there is one, and that requires certain immediate reactions, mainly conservation, cutting down especially of outdoor water use, changing the rates so as to send a potent pricing signal, prohibiting certain kinds of use, especially watering outdoors.
And the city's done tremendous work on conservation. They lead the country as far as I'm concerned. They're using barely more water than they used 20 years ago. With 1 million more people, it's legitimate. They had reason to brag.
Because the city had less water available to it, and the city was still growing, water conservation has been one of our most important programs in the last 30 years. And we have 1 million more people compared to 1970, but the water demand has remained the same. And the increase in population and not an increase in water consumption is strictly due to conservation.
There's more that can be conserved down there. In an average urban situation, about half the water is used outdoors. Now, I'm a botanist, I am a gardener, and I love going to LA and seeing birds of paradise and banana trees and tree ferns. I love that. I do not want it to be a desert, but I imagine, it could be squeezed a bit. It could still be squeezed more.
We are changing our ways in our landscaping. I stand on grass here. I love this grass here, but I know there may be a plan one day that should alter it, because it does need a lot of water to feed this beautiful grass.
And there's people down there doing it. I know somebody that's sitting on 15,000 gallons of water they collected off the roof in a cistern that they're going to use on their garden. I know people that are taking up asphalt and putting down material that water can percolate through. They're just whole new ways of thinking, and this is where we need young people. They've got lively minds, they've got a lot of energy, they're very creative.
We have to rethink the entire water supply picture for LA. We have to recognize that we have these external water resources that are under great pressure and are likely to be constrained in the future. We certainly cannot look to those resources to expand in the future. So we have to look to our own resources, our indigenous resources.
The city is expected to continue growing. It's not going to stop right away. But what the department is planning to do is not have to import any more water from anywhere else. So we're going to use the supplies we have more efficiently and generate more local supply. So we're going to use reclamation of treated wastewater. We're going to use recycled water more. We're going to have more conservation. We're going to capture local rainwater better instead of letting it just run down the river into the ocean. And we're also going to use groundwater recharge more effectively so that we can use our local wells better and have that as a kind of a local reservoir of good water.
These are the kinds of programs that the city of Los Angeles is now pursuing with great vigor in order to provide for the future of Los Angeles. 100 years ago, we had the building of the aqueduct, which enabled this desert to bloom. Now we have to put in place new programs and new plans to provide for the future growth of the city.